What if the government's latest move on Bitcoin is not the victory everyone thinks it is? On January 23, 2025, an executive order was signed. The headlines screamed about progress. Crypto advocates celebrated in the streets. Bitcoin's price jumped. Social media exploded with predictions of a golden age for digital assets. Finally, Washington gets it, people said. Finally, someone in power understands the future of money. But there is a problem with all that celebration. Almost nobody bothered to read what the order actually says. And the handful of people who did read it, the ones who understand how strategic reserves actually function in government policy, are not celebrating. They are looking at their history books. They are remembering 1933. They are seeing a pattern that played out before with devastating consequences. Because 92 years ago, the United States government used nearly identical language to justify the largest theft of private wealth in American history. They called gold a strategic national asset. They said holding it was essential for economic stability. They granted the Treasury sweeping powers to acquire and manage it. And then they made private ownership illegal for 4 decades. Executive Order 6102, the confiscation that destroyed generational wealth while the government pretended it was protecting the nation. If you think that cannot happen again, if you believe modern governments operate differently, then you have not been paying attention to what happens when sovereign debt reaches levels that threaten the entire system. Let me walk you through what this Bitcoin executive order actually contains. Not the sanitized version you saw on Twitter. Not the cheerleading from influencers who profit when you stay bullish. The actual legal framework being constructed right now. The specific authorities being granted that mirror 1933 almost word for word. The infrastructure being built for acquisition at scale. And most critically, the timeline for what comes next when celebration turns to confiscation. Because this order is not an ending. This is stage 1 of a multi-phase operation to position the federal government for mandatory acquisition and revaluation of Bitcoin, precisely the way Roosevelt's administration acquired and revalued gold. When that next phase executes, when the official valuations are announced, when compliance becomes compulsory under penalty of prosecution, you will either have positioned yourself correctly or you will watch everything disappear. This breakdown will show you exactly which side of that line you need to be on before the window closes. The document carries an optimistic title, Strengthening American Leadership in Digital Financial Technology. It sounds forward-thinking, it sounds like innovation and competitive advantage. But anyone who's studied government documents knows that titles are public relations exercises. The substance lives in the operational language buried in the sections that most people never read. Section 1 lays out the stated policy objectives. The United States will position itself as the dominant force in digital asset markets globally. Digital assets get classified as vital to national economic security. Then comes the key phrase: the federal government will acquire, hold, and manage digital assets as strategic reserves. Stop and consider what that sentence actually means. This is not about creating a friendly regulatory environment so you can own Bitcoin. This is about the government owning Bitcoin and acquiring it through various means. They plan to build a reserve measured in billions or trillions of dollars, and to manage it the same way they manage petroleum reserves or the gold sitting in Fort Knox. Section 2 establishes the operational authority. The Treasury Department receives instructions to develop comprehensive frameworks for digital asset acquisition. Treasury gets authorization to hold Bitcoin and other digital assets on behalf of the nation. The order mandates creation of custody infrastructure, valuation methodologies, and accounting standards appropriate for government-scale digital asset holdings. Think about what this represents. This is the machinery being assembled, the systems needed to hold massive quantities of Bitcoin at institutional government scale. You do not construct this level of infrastructure for a symbolic gesture or a small proof of concept. You build it when you are preparing to acquire hundreds of billions or potentially trillions of dollars worth of assets. Section 3 addresses acquisition channels, and this is where the language becomes most revealing. The order authorizes acquisition through multiple pathways. First, seizure from criminal operations. This is already happening. The government currently holds approximately 210,000 Bitcoin confiscated from Silk Road, Bitfinex, and various other enforcement actions. Second, acceptance as payment for fines, penalties, and legal settlements. This represents new policy. Federal agencies can now accept Bitcoin as payment and retain it for the strategic reserve rather than liquidating it. Third, purchase through market operations or strategic transactions, direct acquisition through buying. Now notice what the order does not include. No limits, no caps on acquisition amounts, no constraints on how much they can accumulate or how quickly they can do it. This lack of constraint is the most alarming detail. Let me show you why this specific language should terrify anyone who knows their history. Executive Order 6102 from April 5, 1933 carried the title forbidding the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates. Different words, but examine the structural elements. That order declared gold a strategic asset essential to national economic stability and recovery. Trump's order declares Bitcoin a strategic asset vital to national security and economic competitiveness. Identical framing. That order granted Treasury explicit authority to acquire and hold gold on behalf of the United States government. Trump's order grants Treasury explicit authority to acquire and hold digital assets on behalf of the United States government. Same power transfer. That order required mandatory delivery of gold to Federal Reserve banks by a specific deadline. Trump's order does not mandate delivery yet, but it constructs the complete legal architecture for mandatory acquisition in subsequent phases. That order established criminal penalties for noncompliance, 10 years federal imprisonment, $10,000 fines. Trump's order does not specify penalties yet, but the executive and legislative authority exists to add them through follow-on regulations or congressional action. The progression is identical. Declare the asset strategically critical, grant acquisition authority to Treasury, build the operational infrastructure, then impose mandatory requirements. Roosevelt executed steps 1 through 3 in 1933. Step 4 arrived in 1934 with the Gold Reserve Act. Trump just completed steps 1 through 3 on January 23, 2025. Step 4 is being drafted right now. Why would any government want to confiscate Bitcoin from its citizens? The answer is the same reason they confiscated gold 92 years ago: to revalue the asset and eliminate debt that cannot be repaid through conventional means. The United States government currently owes $37 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio stands at 132%. Annual interest payments have reached $1.2 trillion, and they are accelerating upward. By 2027, if current interest rates persist, annual interest expense will exceed $2 trillion. That is more than the defense budget, more than Social Security, more than Medicare, just interest on past borrowing. This debt cannot be repaid. You cannot tax your way out of this hole. The entire GDP of the United States is $28 trillion. You would have to confiscate every dollar of economic output for more than a year just to pay the principal, which obviously destroys the economy that generates tax revenue. You cannot cut spending enough because the mathematics do not work, even if you eliminated every discretionary program. You cannot grow fast enough because the debt is compounding faster than any realistic growth rate. The equation has no solution through normal fiscal policy. There is exactly one mechanism that has worked historically when nations face this level of debt crisis: currency devaluation through hard asset revaluation. Here is the playbook from 1933. The government confiscated privately held gold at the mandated price of $20.67 per troy ounce. Citizens had until May 1st to surrender their gold to Federal Reserve banks or face prosecution. Immediately after confiscation was complete, they revalued gold to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase in the official price. This maneuver accomplished two critical objectives simultaneously. First, it manufactured value on the government's balance sheet out of thin air. Their gold reserves went from roughly $4 billion in value to approximately $6.8 billion overnight. Free money created through accounting. Second, it devalued the dollar relative to gold, which inflated away the real burden of all dollar-denominated debt. The government still owed the same nominal number of dollars, but those dollars were now worth 40% less in real terms. They erased 40% of the debt's actual weight through monetary manipulation and currency debasement. And the entire operation was perfectly legal because they controlled the gold supply and they controlled the official pricing mechanism. Now apply this exact template to Bitcoin in 2025. The government acquires 1 million Bitcoin over the next 2 to 3 years. That is the specific target outlined in Senator Cynthia Lummis's Bitcoin Act, which aligns perfectly with the executive order's framework. At current market prices hovering around $100,000 per coin, 1 million Bitcoin represents $100 billion. But the government will not pay market rates for all of it. They will acquire through seizures that cost nothing, through fines and settlements that actually generate revenue, and through below-market mandatory sales if they implement confiscation policy. Let us assume their blended average cost ends up at $60,000 per Bitcoin. That is a total investment of $60 billion to acquire 1 million coins. Now they are sitting on 1 million Bitcoin. Then comes the revaluation announcement. For purposes of the United States government balance sheet and official accounting, Bitcoin will be valued at $1 million per coin. Why precisely 1 million? Because that is the number that makes the mathematics work for debt reduction. At 1 million per coin, their 1 million Bitcoin position equals $1 trillion in asset value. Combined with a simultaneous revaluation of existing gold reserves, which they will almost certainly do in parallel, the government suddenly holds $5 to $7 trillion in hard assets on the balance sheet. These assets directly offset liabilities, and they can be deployed as collateral. This does not eliminate the $37 trillion in debt, but it fundamentally restructures the government's balance sheet. More importantly, it devalues the dollar against Bitcoin exactly the way the 1933 revaluation devalued the dollar against gold. Every dollar-denominated debt obligation just lost substantial real value. The government effectively inflates away several trillion dollars of debt burden through asset manipulation, while claiming they are strengthening the currency by backing it with hard assets. It is the perfect crime disguised as sound monetary policy. Just like 1933, it requires controlling the Bitcoin supply first. That is what the executive order enables. Let me trace the operational phases of how this unfolds, because the timeline matters for positioning yourself correctly. Phase 1 is what just happened on January 23, 2025. The executive order is signed. Strategic Reserve Authority is established. The legal framework is created. Media celebrates it as pro-innovation policy. Retail investors cheer and buy more Bitcoin. Price pumps on the news. This phase is the setup. It looks positive because most people do not read past the headlines. Phase 2 happens throughout 2025 into early 2026. The working group mandated by the executive order begins operations. The Treasury develops acquisition frameworks. Custody infrastructure is built. Accounting methodologies are standardized. Valuation formulas are created. During this phase, the government quietly accumulates Bitcoin through seizures and settlements. It may also make some open market purchases, claiming it is building the strategic reserve gradually to avoid market disruption. This phase is the build-out. It looks like responsible policy implementation. Phase 3 arrives in late 2026 or early 2027. The debt crisis reaches a critical threshold. Interest payments hit $2 trillion annually. Bond auctions start failing as foreign buyers pull back. The dollar faces a confidence crisis in international markets. Something breaks in the financial system. Maybe a major bank fails. Maybe a sovereign debt crisis in Europe or Asia spreads globally. Maybe a geopolitical event disrupts energy markets and triggers stagflation. The specific trigger does not matter. What matters is that the crisis creates the political justification for emergency measures. This phase is the catalyst. It looks like an external shock requiring government action. Phase 4 is the confiscation. Emergency legislation gets passed or a follow-on executive order is signed declaring that private Bitcoin holdings threaten national financial stability. Citizens receive mandatory sale orders. You must sell your Bitcoin to the government at the official price by a specific deadline. That official price will be below market, maybe $70,000 when market is at $150,000, maybe $100,000 when market is at $300,000. The discount does not matter because compliance is mandatory. You either sell at the official price or face criminal prosecution for hoarding a strategic national asset during a financial emergency. This phase is wealth transfer. It looks like necessary crisis management. Phase 5 is the revaluation. After confiscation is substantially complete, after the government controls most domestic Bitcoin through forced sales and seizures, they announce the new official valuation. Bitcoin is now worth $1 million per coin for government accounting purposes. Their balance sheet explodes with newly created value. The dollar devalues against Bitcoin just like it devalued against gold in 1934. Dollar-denominated debt loses real value. The crisis gets solved through accounting manipulation. This phase is the endgame. It looks like bold leadership that saved the economy. The parallels to 1933 are not approximate. They are precise. Roosevelt's order came during the banking crisis when the system was on the verge of total collapse. The next Bitcoin confiscation will come during a debt crisis when the system faces default or hyperinflation. Roosevelt's order was sold as stabilizing the economy and protecting American interests. The Bitcoin confiscation will be sold as protecting national security and ensuring financial stability. Roosevelt's order gave people about 4 weeks to comply. The Bitcoin order will probably give 60 to 90 days, but the principle is identical. Comply or face prosecution. Roosevelt's order exempted small amounts for legitimate uses, rare coin collections, and industrial applications. The Bitcoin order will probably exempt tiny amounts, maybe $5,000 worth, maybe $10,000, just enough to claim it is not total confiscation. Roosevelt's revaluation happened immediately after confiscation was complete. The Bitcoin revaluation will follow the same timeline. The template works. It worked in 1933. It will work again because most people do not know the history, and the ones who do know it think it cannot happen to them. Now, I will address the objections running through your mind because I can anticipate every single one. First, Trump campaigned on being pro-Bitcoin. He spoke at conferences, and he promised to protect crypto. You might think he would not betray that base by confiscating their holdings. Consider, however, what happened with Roosevelt. He campaigned on fiscal conservatism and sound money principles, and his platform explicitly opposed currency manipulation. Then he confiscated gold 6 weeks after taking office, because the debt crisis left him no alternative. Politicians campaign on whatever gets them elected. They govern based on whatever the circumstances demand. Trump might genuinely appreciate Bitcoin technology. That appreciation becomes irrelevant when annual interest payments threaten to consume half the federal budget, and the only mathematical solution is hard asset revaluation. Personal preference does not override fiscal survival. Promises do not guarantee policy. Second, you will hear that Bitcoin is decentralized and therefore impossible to confiscate the way gold was confiscated. The network is decentralized, that is true. Ownership on the ground often is not. Many Americans hold Bitcoin through centralized services. Coinbase has your complete identity and transaction history. Kraken reported purchases to the IRS. Gemini knows what you hold and when you bought it. Every centralized exchange that required Know Your Customer verification has a database with your name, social security number, and Bitcoin addresses. The government does not necessarily need to seize coins on the blockchain. They can send a notice listing your known holdings and set a deadline to transfer them to a government Bitcoin address at the official price. If you do not comply, they can freeze bank accounts, seize traditional assets, and prosecute you under emergency financial regulations. Decentralization protects the network, but it does not automatically protect individuals from a legal confiscation process. Third, some say the political backlash would be massive, and that protests, lawsuits, and elections would stop it. Yes, there was substantial backlash against gold confiscation. It happened anyway. There was enormous opposition to bank bailouts in 2008. They happened anyway. There was widespread anger about money printing in 2020 and 2021. It happened anyway. When governments face existential fiscal crises, they implement whatever measures are necessary and manage the political fallout afterward. By the time organized resistance becomes effective, your Bitcoin may already have been transferred to government addresses at below market prices. You can vote against the politicians later, but you cannot reverse the confiscation once the wealth has moved. Backlash can be too late. Fourth, you will hear this is conspiracy thinking, that there is no concrete evidence any of this is being planned. The evidence is the executive order itself, the language establishing strategic reserve authority, the framework for official government valuation, and the infrastructure for custody at scale. There is a historical parallel to Executive Order 6102 and the Gold Reserve Act from 1933 that uses nearly identical legal structures. This is not mere theory. It is pattern recognition based on documented precedent. Governments facing impossible debt loads have used the same playbook because the playbook works. Confiscate hard assets from citizens, revalue those assets on government books, debase the currency relative to the hard asset, erase a portion of debt through inflation and balance sheet manipulation, and transfer wealth from private citizens to the sovereign. It worked for Roosevelt. It worked when the gold window closed in 1971. It could work again if a debt crisis peaks between now and 2027. Evidence can look like policy language. Let me be absolutely clear about what I am claiming and what I am not claiming. I am not saying Bitcoin confiscation will definitely happen. I am not saying there is zero possibility of alternative outcomes. I am saying the legal architecture is being constructed right now, the operational framework is being built, the historical template is being followed with remarkable precision, and the fiscal mathematics make this pathway highly probable compared to alternatives. Could the government find a different solution? Could they actually implement serious spending cuts? Could they reform entitlement programs to bring them in line with revenue? Could they grow the economy fast enough to outrun the debt accumulation? These outcomes are theoretically possible. They are practically impossible given political realities and mathematical constraints. Those solutions require immense political courage, painful short-term decisions, and decades of sustained discipline. Confiscation requires only a crisis and an executive order. One pathway demands the impossible. The other pathway demands only what governments have done repeatedly throughout history. Which scenario seems more likely based on how political systems actually operate under pressure? I am not advocating that you sell all your Bitcoin and exit the market. I am advocating that you hold Bitcoin in ways that provide protection from government confiscation attempts. Self-custody removes you from centralized exchange databases that create easy confiscation targets. Use hardware wallets that you control with private keys that exist nowhere except in your possession. Use multi-signature setups that require multiple approvals to move funds. Diversify custody geographically across multiple jurisdictions. If confiscation happens in the United States, having Bitcoin secured through international structures provides options. If confiscation does not happen, you still own your Bitcoin exactly as you did before, only with better security and more sovereignty. Preparation protects you from the downside while maintaining upside exposure. Here is what you should be doing right now during this window before Phase 3 begins. First, immediately move any Bitcoin held on exchanges into self-custody. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. Every day your Bitcoin sits on Coinbase is another day your holdings are documented in a database that feeds directly to Treasury and IRS systems. Get it off exchanges. Get it into hardware wallets. Get it under your exclusive control, where no third party can freeze it or surrender it on your behalf. Second, if you hold substantial amounts, consider establishing international custody structures. Look for jurisdictions with strong property rights and limited treaty obligations with the United States. Consider entities established in Singapore, Switzerland, or other jurisdictions that have historically resisted United States overreach in financial matters. This is complex territory that requires professional legal counsel. Wealthy individuals and families have protected assets from aggressive governments for centuries using international structures. This is that moment in history where those structures matter. Emphasize international protections when you plan. Third, diversify into additional hard assets beyond Bitcoin. Do not concentrate everything in a single asset class that might be specifically targeted. Consider physical gold and silver held outside the banking system. Consider productive real estate that generates cash flow. Consider commodities, energy-producing assets, and businesses that create value regardless of what happens to currency. If Bitcoin gets confiscated and revalued, you want meaningful wealth in assets that were not targeted. Fourth, understand the compliance game theory before you are forced to make decisions under pressure. In 1933, most Americans complied with gold confiscation because they feared prosecution. Actual prosecutions were relatively rare because the government could not practically prosecute millions of citizens. They relied on voluntary compliance backed by fear of consequences. The same dynamic will apply to Bitcoin. They will threaten severe penalties. They will prosecute a few high-profile cases to create examples and generate media coverage. But prosecuting millions of people for retaining their Bitcoin is logistically impractical and politically dangerous. They need voluntary compliance driven by fear. That means the actual enforcement risk is substantially lower than the threatened risk. I am not advising you to violate laws. I am advising you to understand the realistic enforcement landscape before panic drives you into decisions you will regret. Assess your personal risk tolerance now. Decide what your response will be if confiscation orders arrive. Do not make that critical decision in the emotional chaos of the moment when the news is screaming about financial emergency and criminal penalties. Fifth, monitor the warning signals closely over the next 18 months. Confiscation will not appear out of nowhere. There will be escalating indicators in the year to 18 months before. Expect increased regulatory pressure on exchanges with new reporting requirements beyond current standards. Expect proposals for taxes on unrealized capital gains specifically targeting digital assets. Official statements from the Treasury or the Federal Reserve warning that cryptocurrency creates systemic stability risks, restrictions on self-custody, requirements to register private wallets, and congressional hearings about the threat of unregulated digital assets are all warning signs. When you observe these signals accelerating and intensifying, That is your final warning to take protective action. Move your remaining exchange holdings to self-custody. Finalize any international custody structures. Convert a portion of Bitcoin into other hard assets. The timeline I have outlined suggests confiscation is most likely in 2027, but watch the signals rather than trusting a specific date. It could arrive sooner if the debt crisis accelerates. It could be delayed if they find temporary measures to extend the timeline. The signals tell you where you actually are in the cycle. Sixth, educate yourself on the historical precedents so you recognize the pattern as it develops. Study Executive Order 6102 in detail. Read about the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. Understand how the confiscation was implemented, how citizens responded, and what happened to those who complied versus those who did not. Study the closure of the gold window in 1971 when Nixon broke the Bretton Woods Agreement. Look at Cyprus in 2013 when the government confiscated bank deposits to bail out the financial system. Examine India in 2016 when they invalidated existing currency overnight. These are the templates. These are the playbooks. When you see the pattern starting to repeat, you will recognize it immediately while everyone else is confused. The executive order signed on January 23rd is not what the mainstream narrative claims. It is not pro-innovation policy that helps Bitcoin adoption. It is not American leadership in digital finance. It is the legal foundation for strategic acquisition at scale, official government valuation authority, and eventual mandatory confiscation. The exact framework Roosevelt used in 1933. The language is nearly identical. The fiscal situation is more desperate. The mechanism will be the same. Acquire at suppressed official prices. Revalue higher on government books. Debase the dollar against Bitcoin. Inflate away trillions in real debt burden. Transfer massive wealth from private citizens to the sovereign balance sheet. The only variable is whether you position yourself correctly before the window closes. The order is signed. The working group is operational. The infrastructure is being constructed as I speak. The timeline runs from now through late 2026 or 2027. You have perhaps 18 to 36 months maximum. That is not much time to restructure custody of significant assets, to establish international protections if you hold substantial amounts, to diversify into additional hard assets, and to prepare mentally for what is approaching. Start immediately. Read the executive order yourself. Do not trust my interpretation or anyone else. Verify everything I have told you. Then take action based on what you discover, not based on what crypto influencers with referral links tell you to believe. Because when the confiscation letters arrive, when the official prices get announced, when compliance deadlines get imposed, when enforcement actions begin against high-profile non-compliers, it will be too late. Your exchange accounts will be frozen. Your options will have disappeared. You will either comply and surrender your Bitcoin at confiscatory prices, or you will face federal prosecution for hoarding strategic assets during a national financial emergency. The people who survive this with their wealth intact are the people who saw the pattern developing and positioned themselves before the crisis arrived. The people who lose everything are the people who celebrated the executive order without reading it, who believed the government was on their side, who assumed that what happened in 1933 could never happen again. If this analysis changed your understanding of what Trump's Bitcoin order actually represents, if you now recognize that pro-crypto marketing can disguise confiscation infrastructure, then you are beginning to understand how government policy actually functions beneath the public relations veneer, not the headlines, not the political speeches, the legal mechanics and historical patterns. The countdown is running, the choice is yours.